Hello everybody and good evening. My name's Don Arleth and welcome to our main edition of World News Tonight, coming to you live from Warsaw. We must sustain our resolve, our effort and support for Ukraine, said U.S. President Joe Biden as he visited Berlin on Friday and met with the leaders of the Quad, Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom. These leaders reiterated as long as it takes for Ukraine. We'll have more on that coming up in just a bit. But first on, let's take a look at the headlines. U.S. President Joe Biden calls for continued determination to support Ukraine. Will the EU take a tougher stance on migration? And 100 years after their death, 30 British soldiers will be remembered in Poland. As long as it takes. Sound familiar? Those hoping for firmer resolve in support of Ukraine might be disappointed after the leaders of the United States, Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom met in Berlin to discuss how to support the country defending itself from Russian aggression. While resolve must be sustained, fears of NATO entanglement remain very real. Our correspondent Mark Steele reports from Berlin.
Joe Biden's visit to Germany included meetings with Europe's big three, so the German Chancellor, the French President, and the British Prime Minister. This is likely the last visit of President Biden to Europe before the end of his presidency. To many, it may seem that Biden is trying to convey to his European leaders that the continent may soon be on its own. On the one hand, there are fears that if Donald Trump wins the race to the White House, then support for this part of Europe, for NATO, and for Ukraine could end. On the other hand, it is unclear whether Kamala Harris will continue with all Biden's staunch policies towards this part of Europe and towards Ukraine.
We cannot let up. We must sustain our support. In my view, we must keep going until Ukraine wins a just and durable peace consistent with the UN Charter.
Today's meetings in Berlin focused on the war in Ukraine. European leaders and Biden were expected to talk about how to help Ukraine after Zelensky failed to convince Western leaders from NATO and the European Union to support his 5-point victory plan. One of the points of this plan, an immediate invitation into NATO, was essentially rejected by all Western leaders gathered yesterday for the European Council summit and the NATO defense ministers meeting taking place in Brussels. Zelensky was not part of today's meetings here in Berlin, and no representative from Poland was invited as well. Marek Steele, TVP World.
A tougher stance on illegal migration. At the European Council summit in Brussels, EU leaders led by Poland backed a plan to outsource asylum processing to third countries, including partnerships with North African nations. This reflects a broader rightward shift in EU migration policy as leaders increasingly favor stricter measures to curb irregular migration. However, the summit offered few details on how the plan would be implemented or funded, raising concerns about its feasibility. Critics warn that the move could undermine asylum rights and humanitarian obligations. Sasha Farbach has more.
Migration was the key topic as the European Summit of Leaders concluded on Thursday, very much led by a major shift of policy, which would have been unprecedented just 6 or 8 months before, moving the whole bloc further to the right. Stronger restrictions, stronger policy needed for tackling migration, illegal migration, very much moved and led by Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who very much on his arrival made it clear that he had a view and a vision for Europe, that there was very much instrumentalized hybrid attacks on migration on his border, and rather than face stiff opposition, he himself was found actually very much with understanding by other leaders. Let's hear what he had to say in terms of when putting the question to him if Poland is now leading that debate, at the end of yesterday's press conference.
I wrapped up all the meetings with key players that I had lined up and achieved everything I wanted to. Most importantly, I was met with understanding. It was never about suspending the right to asylum wholesale, but a temporary local measures introduced wherever the border is being crossed illegally.
And although slightly reluctant, it's clear that Poland has very much come out of this European Council as the leader in this debate in terms of what actually is next. Now, it's one thing to say this at the European Council, of looking at the final conclusions. There was no clear plan of exactly what's next. Remember, this is not necessarily law, but this will certainly be listened to. This casts now doubt over the EU's migration asylum pact, which still needs 2 years to be implemented in full, but this may well now go back to being amended, which is a task for the European Parliament, where some MEPs were not happy at some of the conclusions and voices from yesterday.
So my personal view is that on the one hand I have quite some understanding for the Polish situation, because migrants are used as a weapon of hybrid warfare by Belarus and by Russia to pressure us. On the other hand, we just had the big EU migration deal negotiated in January of this year, and it hasn't even been implemented yet. And so I'm questioning if we not should either use our new instrument instead of developing special solutions for special situations before we even try to use what we negotiated.
But overall, nevertheless, it is a clear policy change. Much of Europe, not just Poland, the Baltics and the Nordics, but other countries further afield, understand that migration needs to be tackled, and this is something that we'll hear much more of in the coming weeks and months ahead. That's Sasha Farbach for TVP World in Brussels.
A future with the EU or maybe Russia instead? That's the question Moldovans will answer later this weekend. A referendum on a constitutional amendment to reflect Moldova's European Union ambitions is fast approaching. Our correspondent Karolina Stoltzman is in Chisinau. Good evening, Karolina. And now, can you tell us which way is Moldova leaning? Will we expect people to go down the European road, or will this weekend turn Moldova to the east and back towards Moscow?
Good evening, Don. So I think it's best if I start with reading out to you the question that Moldovans will be asked on Sunday. And this, of course, comes straight from the Moldovan Central Electoral Committee. And it goes: do you support the amendment of the Constitution with a view to the accession of the Republic of Moldova to the European Union? Now, regardless of what Moldovans will say, whether it will be yes or no, there is a certain percentage threshold that has to be met when it comes to the voter turnout for their answer to be legally binding, and that is 33%. And the most recent polls that have been commissioned by the local think tank, Watchdog Community, and carried out by CBS Research paint quite a positive picture of that. Let me give you some numbers on that. So the data compares information on the referendum and the interest in it from August and from just 2 days ago. So this is really fresh data. So in August, 65.8% of those asked said that they will take part in the referendum. Now this number has raised increasingly, as it now stands at 76.3%. And when it comes to whether they will say yes to the question, well, back in August, 52.2% of those asked said that they would. And now this also has increased to 55.1%. Now, I have taken it upon myself to also go out to the streets of Chisinau and ask the people what they think of the referendum. So let's hear it from them.
So I think this referendum is not for Europe, it's for one person, for my son.
I don't have a concrete opinion yet, but I will think about it. I want to learn more information so I can make the right choice.
Will you vote this weekend?
Yes, of course.
Do you know who you want to vote for?
I know.
And will you take part in the referendum as well?
Yes.
And how do you feel about the European Union? Does Moldova need it?
Yes, of course.
Now, when it comes to the importance of this referendum, well, it is particularly important when it comes to securing the accession efforts for Moldova, especially in face of the upcoming parliamentary elections next year, because similarly to the referendum and to the presidential vote taking place on Sunday, Russia has a huge influence on the voting situation here, because a lot of pro-European candidates are faced with a pro-Russian opposition. And just this month alone, Moscow has funneled in $15 million American into Moldova to persuade people to say no to the referendum question. And of course, this clearly shows that Moscow is trying to tighten its grip on Moldova, but it seems, for now at least, that Moldova might be slipping away. Back to you, Don.
All right, Carolina. Well, it should be interesting to see. We'll be paying close attention to your coverage. Thanks for your report. Now, Georgia's fight against its Russian-style law on foreign agents is heating up with an election just around the corner. That vote is seen as a major choice for the country, either to move closer to the EU, similar to Moldova, or to Russia. Aaron Dahmen has more.
In Georgia, a fight for democracy over the country's controversial foreign agent law.
It's not about the law anymore, it's about their decision to distance Georgia from the West, from the EU, from the NATO, and take Georgia to the direction of Russia and make Georgia the ally of Russia.
It's just, it's unbelievable what's happening, really. It's just unbelievable that they could turn around Georgia's course and what we've been fighting for and working for 35 years just like this. It's unbelievable.
That was in May when tens of thousands of people took to the streets with Georgian and EU flags in protest at the legislation, which mirrors a similar law passed in Russia. It requires organisations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence or face fines. But now, a raft of media and civil society agencies are taking their battle to the European Court of Human Rights after Georgia's own constitutional court refused to suspend the law.
The organization submitting the complaint address public issues such as environmental protection, assistance to people with disabilities, protection of women and children from violence, judicial reform, fighting corruption, investigative journalism, and etc.
In a statement of conclusions issued on Friday, the European Council again pushed back on the actions of the Georgian government, saying they are jeopardizing the country's European path.
We expressed our concern about the situation in Georgia, where the government's drift is leading to a de facto halt in the accession process, and where the Georgian people will have their say in a few days' time.
Voters will indeed have their say next Saturday on October 26, with the election held at a crucial time for a country at a crossroads between the EU and Russia, and the future of Georgia's relationship with the world is also at stake.
The strategic relations with Brussels, Washington, and other strategic partners are already ruined, and the current government doesn't show any sign to restore these relations and stop this democratic backsliding.
All the way back in May, locals held posters with the slogan, "We choose Europe, not Russia." Whether voters agree is an open question for now.
Big choices ahead. Well, now we turn our focus to Poland, and the Polish parliament has just adopted a significantly higher tax on cigarettes and e-cigarettes in an effort to curb the rising trend of smoking in the country. Starting next year, the excise tax on regular cigarettes will go up by 25%, while the tax on e-cigarettes will rise by 50%. Poland currently has the second lowest price of cigarettes in all of Europe, only behind Bulgaria. Now, that's according to the European Commission. Kazimierz Wysiak has more in his report.
Smoking kills. This grim reminder, found on almost every pack of regular cigarettes in Europe, seems to have failed to reduce the number of Poles indulging in this harmful habit. That's why members of the Polish parliament decided on Friday to drastically increase the tax on tobacco, starting from 2025.
A step in a good direction in order to decrease the consumption of tobacco products, but as well the vaporizing and vaporizing products, e-cigarettes, even the ones that do not contain tobacco.
Apart from raising the excise on regular cigarettes by 25%, the Polish ruling coalition also decided to increase the tax on e-cigarettes by 50%. Disposable electronic cigarettes are quickly growing in popularity, especially among the youth.
Because they are much healthier than the regular ones, and probably because they taste better.
The recent trend of young people turning to e-cigarettes has been confirmed by the Polish Institute of Oncology. Irena Przepiórka, a therapist treating nicotine addiction at the institute, says that this type of cigarette often lures its users into a false sense of security.
Many people think these products are less harmful, but these cigarettes also contain substances which are harmful to our health. They can damage our respiratory, circulatory and immune systems, but also, crucially, they can cause various types of cancer.
According to several research papers for the universities of Melbourne, Wellington and Seoul, smoking is often perceived as a rite of passage by young people.
I believe we first do it to impress others. Also, as we struggle to communicate because of social media, we often use cigarettes as a way to break the ice. At parties, for example.
Nearly 1 in 3 adults in Poland is a smoker, according to the 2023 study by the Polish Academy of Sciences. The situation is not much better in the rest of the European Union. The statistics provided by the European Commission say 26% of the entire EU population smokes. They also point out that 700,000 people in the bloc die due to smoking-related issues every year. According to the Polish Health Ministry, the number of smoking polls is steadily rising year by year, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. It remains to be seen whether the new tax can curb this trend. From Warsaw, TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
2.5 million Poles live in extreme poverty, according to the European Anti-Poverty Network's report for last year. The problem has increased by 47% in comparison with 2022. It's the country's worst result in nearly a decade. Ovidiusz Nicheja has the details.
6.6% of the entire Polish population lives in extreme poverty. The authors of the report attribute the alarming data to soaring inflation, lack of indexation of social benefits, and economic stagnation in 2023.
Rising prices without a corresponding increase in wages or benefits have left more people teetering on the edge of subsistence, sliding into extreme poverty.
The group most at risk is the elderly. Institutions that bring help to those in need have experienced firsthand the increasing numbers of people in poverty. Numerous consecutive crises have exacerbated the situation.
Taking into account what has been happening in our country in recent years, I'm not surprised. Looking at who is reaching out to the foundation, there are indeed more and more people.
The government is alarmed by the data and promises action.
No country can accept that so many people live in extreme poverty. We have social programs, we have the 800+ benefit, we are increasing allowance, so of course work is going on in the ministry and we are planning welfare reforms.
The statistics used by the European Anti-Poverty Network date from 2023, when Poland was ruled by the Law and Justice Party until mid-December.
I believe that our social policies and programs have ultimately allowed us to deal with poverty.
Such empty words from Law and Justice about how they cared for families and so on are at odds with reality and the horrific data.
Political rhetoric aside, experts say the issue requires action if next year is to see a much-needed improvement.
Righting the wrongs of the past for over a century, their bodies lay in unmarked graves waiting to be discovered by one man who never gave up the search. 30 British soldiers from World War I buried in Opole in southwestern Poland are to be finally remembered, Paweł Trzaskowski reports.
Locating the burial site has become a life's mission for Jim Powry. Retired and with plenty of time on his hands, he started looking into his family history and discovered that his father's first cousin, Bombardier Henry Powry from the 62nd Battery of the Royal Field Artillery, was buried in Opole in 1921, along with 29 other British soldiers. So Powry started to dig deeper.
And again, having time on my hands, I decided to come out to Opole and have a look. And I discovered that the cemetery was derelict and a very sad place. And I thought it was unfitting for 30 British soldiers to be languishing in such a condition.
To help me shed more light on the discovery, I asked Alexander Weber, who's been writing on the story, to explain what the British soldiers were doing in Upper Silesia.
In the wake of World War I, this region of Central Europe was very volatile. The territory was being disputed between Germany and Poland. The British were there as a peacekeeping force.
As the graves were unmarked, Powrie carried out his own investigation. With the help of 2 local history enthusiasts, he amassed a plethora of archival material, including pictures of the burial site. One of them turned out to be particularly helpful.
And in it, we could identify an existing building that is still in the old cemetery. And we were then able to pinpoint with 100% accuracy the location of the British plot.
Initially, 41 British troops were buried in Opole, but the bodies of 11 were later exhumed and reburied in a British war cemetery. The remaining 30 were left with no recognition as they died after the official end of the war.
They were victims of bureaucracy. They got forgotten. Simply by the Ministry of Defence, they overlooked them. They had other things to do.
But Jim Powrie fought his own battle with bureaucracy to restore the graves, and he won. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission finally promised to undertake the restoration of the British plot. Memorials are to be erected in the near future.
After U.S. President Joe Biden's meeting with the Quad on Friday in Berlin, we're left with more questions than answers. We also have migration taking center stage at the European Council there in Brussels. And now joining me to discuss these developments is Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She's a senior fellow. Hello, Ivana. Thank you for joining me on World News Tonight.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes, now maybe I'm being a little too harsh, maybe a little too critical at the recent visit of President Biden there to Berlin to talk with 4 very important countries here in Europe, the leaders of which to garner more support for Ukraine, but that's not all they talked about. But if we look at the precarious situation that the country currently finds itself, and also we hear that President Zelensky was unable to convince Western leaders of his victory plan, what is your impression of this meeting that Joe Biden just held in Berlin, President Zelensky not being a party to?
First of all, what you have just stated, you're not harsh. That's exactly also how I see the situation. Lots of words, no facts. I'm not saying, by any means that we haven't provided Ukraine with help, but that is not enough. It's enough help to survive, but not to win. And I was not also surprised that Zelensky and his victory plan did not resonate with some people in the West, especially because if you, for example, take a look at how Washington policy towards Ukraine is, it seems to me that here we are also not clear what the victory is and what and how we want Ukraine to win. So having said that, today meetings, I think it was an important meeting to gather the allies and to discuss what needs to be done. And I hope there are a lot of things that they discussed that we don't know about, because what it's publicly available is just basically statements that they are going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that is, as I mentioned, not enough. Because think about this. The war in Ukraine, it's not only about Ukraine. Putin is at war with the West, period. That's an undeniable fact. Just look what's happening in Moldova. Just look what's happening in Georgia. Just look how Putin has also been trying to challenge NATO in the West, including hybrid activities through sabotage, etc., etc. So if this is not the challenging of the West, then I don't know what it is. Not only that, he's also dealing with North Korea, China, and Iran to gather his allies to help him to accomplish his objectives that are significantly more than his war in Ukraine. The third thing that is tremendously important that I want to emphasize is that whoever believes, including President Trump, who firmly believes that he can stop this war probably in 24 hours, is sorely mistaken. Because if you carefully listened to Putin's statements, he claimed that he does not want to negotiate. So for him, he would use negotiation just to buy more time, to replenish his army, to reposition his army, and to continue. And that's why it's tremendously important right now to continue to send Ukraine all the weapons Ukraine needs to win, because that is not going to end only in Ukraine. Just take a look at what's happening right now, what you just mentioned before our talk in Moldova, but also in Georgia. Just look what is happening in the Western Balkans when NATO also warned a few days ago on possible escalations, let alone what is happening in the global south. So having said that, we are thinking tactically and operationally, and Putin is thinking strategically. And the worst part of this whole story is that while some people in the West like to put Putin on a pedestal thinking that he's a master strategist, let's not forget he was also a mediocre KGB agent. So having said that, it's very sad that we are actually competing and losing against such circumstances.
So all these red flags are there. You just enumerated many of them. Yet we are reluctant to do very much about that. Now, we look at the United States as kind of the leader when it comes to making some of these major decisions, whether Ukraine can use long-range weapons to strike targets deep in Russia. Are we waiting for November 5th? Biden is not going to be around. His days are numbered in the Oval Office. Is he still just waiting for these elections to pan out? Do you think we're going to get some more concrete decisions, say come November 6th, depending on the outcome?
I truly hope that some people in Washington, D.C. are very careful what they are saying right now, only because of the elections. But we are going to see what is going to happen after November the 6th. If Trump wins, I do believe there are a lot of concerns, right concerns, that are coming from Europe because of his approach, how he plans to approach Russia's war in Ukraine. We already see for his tenure, that he was very weak on Russia. If Kamala wins, we still don't know, what is going to be the amount of support that she is going to prioritize for Ukraine. But the good news is also that countries in Western Europe are waking up to Russia's threat. I was recently in Poland, so people in Poland absolutely understand what is happening on the ground and why it is tremendously important right now to support Ukraine. But you have mentioned also something extremely important, providing Ukraine with the long-range missiles. The reason why some policymakers in Washington, D.C. are reluctant to allow Ukraine to hit inside Russia, it is because of fear of escalation. And this is absolutely the most ridiculous thing, because Putin has been threatening with escalating the war, even when we wanted to send javelins, even when he wanted to send fighter jets, fill in the blank, any support. And now he's escalating with this. The second thing is nuclear escalation. As soon as there were discussions here in Washington, D.C. about allowing Ukraine to strike inside Russia, Putin immediately announced the change in nuclear doctrine. So it is the part of his psychological game. And unfortunately, it works, because if you look at the statements of some policymakers here in Washington, D.C., but also in Europe, they keep talking about possible escalations, and even some people about a World War III attitude, which is exactly what Russia has been pushing as a narrative in the information space.
Yes, it seems like they're forcing, Vladimir Putin's strategy is forcing the West to draw its own self-imposed red lines. Very unfortunate time for Ukraine. Ivana Stradner, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.